One of the advantages of coming sort of towards the end of the morning is that we have one panelist who had enacted the performative act of absence, is that I have a bit of a moment to put what I'm trying to do this morning in the context of what happened before. This panel is on performative theologies and how that relates to queerness. And I was thinking about several things. I was struck by Tricia's discussion of unmanning, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the construction of manliness in Christian history and critique it by means of dangerous memory, looking at the idea of resurrecting three little stories from history that will materialize, concretize for us what people have experienced because of ideas of manliness in Christian tradition. So that's just a few comments. The other thing is, I think that what the other panelists did for us is remind us of the power of imagination and poiesis, and how essential that is to political action and political theology. I'm a political action kind of guy and not that serious about theory, I think. So in this panel we deal with theological engagement with the social construction of gender. And in this presentation I will discuss theories of gender construction in late antiquity, so I'm taking you way back, and its negative consequences. When the cultural phenomenon of gender construction gains heavenly sanctions in a world that lives in religious enchantment, the mix proves brutal and, as we will see, lethal. First, I will briefly engage with the work of Virginia Burris and Matthew Keufler in tracing the journey of Roman manliness into the new Christian empire of late antiquity. So as things moved from Roman Empire to Roman Empire plus Christian, things change in very specific ways. I won't have time in this presentation to deal with a much larger fruitful field that's around that, and the Holy Saint Michel Foucault and his work and his influence on how we think about these things, and other work by Burris and McKendrick on eros, gender, sexuality, and traditions of asceticism in Christianity. I wish I could, but there won't be time for that. I will move towards making the sodomite apparent. This word sodomite is one that you will hear a lot in this presentation, and we'll also talk a little bit about sodomy. To do this, I tell three stories from history to demonstrate the sinuous reach of the deadly touch of the imaginaries of manliness in early Christianity. So this is the manning, which needs the opposite of unmanning, I believe. The story I tell here is culture-bound. It's bounded by those places and their offshoots where Western Roman culture constructs gender. So it's colonial. It is bounded by those places and offshoots in ways that shape actions right up to today, and that is one of my arguments and the dangerous memory I would like to underline. In his discussion of the work of Burris and Keufler, Björn Korndorfer points out how Virginia Burris demonstrates the move from manliness as rhetorical performance in the Roman world to a male identity wrapped in what she calls an immutable transcendent order in the emerging Christian empire. From our point of view, the immutable transcendent order, and that's a quote from Burris, itself is a performative reconstruction of manliness. Burris examines the contrast between Favorinus of Arles, who lived from 80 to 160, who is described as an effeminate eunuch and might be thought of as intersex or transsexual, whatever words people want to use in terms of identification or over-identification. And the contrast with Polemon of Laodicea, who lived from 90 to 144, the hyper-Roman male and an opponent of Favorinus. They were having these debates and were challenging each other publicly in all kinds of ways. I just love the stories of Favorinus. He just appeals to me as such a queer figure in history, and I know I'm being very unhistorical by saying that. Burrus, one of the things about Favorinus is that he really made people angry in all kinds of ways with his performances, but he also intrigued people. They put up statues for him, and then he really made Emperor Hadrian angry, but he survived. So quite a survivor. His opponent, Polemon, was of the opinion that manliness was to be physiognomically discerned, to establish virility or effeminacy. And of course, for him, effeminacy was a bad thing. Whereas, on the other hand, Favorinus assumed artful roles to create and reshape a man's natural superiority. But all of it is, of course, about the performance of manliness in the Roman Empire without the Christian piece to it. There's such a great queerness about Favorinus. He brings to us just this whole idea of how manliness can be considered a way of performing yourself into something else. Now, in the world of gender construction, we find these two characters, in them a performative manliness rooted in rhetoric and posture, in a world where a man's adequacy as a man was constantly being contested. And in some ways, we still live in that world. Burrus goes on to argue that the emerging Christian conceptions of manliness in late antiquity, as represented in the work of Athanasius, Gregory, and Ambrose, the three Christian leaders of the time, is intimately intertwined with the framing of the Nicene doctrine of the Trinity. So those of you who know a little bit about Christian doctrine, this idea of defining the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and how the persons of the Trinity relate, she argues, has a lot to do with how manliness becomes constructed. And this shift, though deeply rooted in Roman constructions of manliness, also reshapes manliness in important ways. So she concludes, and I quote, "If the horizon of human becoming is named in terms of Father, Son, and Spirit, this does not in itself make God a male idol, but it does, as a matter of fact, construct both an idealized masculinity and a masculinized transcendence." And I think that's a really important piece. So out of this emerges this idea of a masculinized transcendence. And anything that is not manly is pushed to the side. It's unimportant. Thus, I would observe Roman Christian manliness was in ascent to the heavens with serious consequences for that which is considered effeminate or unmanly or unmanning in the unfolding Christian age. It is the materiality of these shifts of social construction that Keufler picks up in his reflections on the status of the eunuch in that period of time. So Matthew Keufler wrote his doctoral thesis on this and took a long time to publish a book based on that, but it's a very interesting book and a parallel to Burrus's work in all kinds of ways. It turns out that a theology of manliness rooted in transcendent, immutable order leads to a serious material consequence, and many material consequences in his history. Keufler shows how the virtue of manliness, as opposed to unmanliness, established the patriarchy and misogyny, which based everything, in which everything is based in the Roman Empire. Keufler argues that as the Roman Empire crumbled, the virile military man, as the ideal of the empire, became very difficult to maintain. So if you keep losing your wars and your battles, then saying, you're this military guy doesn't work very well anymore. And so you need a new manliness. And the Romans had a strategy for that, of course. It's exactly at the same time that Christianity tried to make itself acceptable in the Roman Empire. So it was this small sect persecuted in all kinds of ways. Now it's growing, and it's trying to say, oh, well, we're good Romans. And so these two things start to intersect. While in response to In response, traditional Roman men reconstructed their identity in terms of the Stoic ideal of sexual abstinence. Christian men, in parallel to this, relied on the encratic way of sexual abstinence, sometimes to the point of self-castration. And the famous Origen of Carthage is one of those guys who is claimed to have castrated himself. It would prove the perfect storm for good sex in our civilization, I think. As Christianity ascended in influence and importance, it drew on the so-called Alexandrian rule developed by Clement of Alexandria, who lived from 150 to 215, in his book, Christ the Educator. And it's interesting, if you go try look that up, there aren't English translations, not full English translations of that little section of the book. Why? Because it's too sexy. As higher Roman male culture, rooted in Stoic tradition, considered passion and pleasure as irrational and therefore, quote, womanly and against law and nature, Clement argues that Christian men too should act rationally in sexual intercourse. Clement's rule allowed for sexual intercourse only for the purpose of procreation. Moreover, to be acceptable, the sexual act, even within marriage, had to occur without passion. It's quite a feat. Any sex with passion and pleasure and without potential procreative results is considered acting against the law of nature and of reason. So the reasonable man is the abstemious man. The negative view of the enjoyment of sexual intercourse would be symbolized in the rise of the importance and respect for a celibate clergy. Thus, by means of the celibate clergy, sex and sexual desire and its expression itself became the major problem to be addressed by the new Christian Rome and its conceptions of manliness. And you can go on with that as you like. So building on these developments, 4th century Christianity developed an immutable, transcendent, puritanical construction of manliness. This kind of manliness denigrates sexual intercourse, especially sexual intercourse that involves desire and passion, and it condemns the appearance of effeminacy, a phenomenon misogynistically understood to be womanly and therefore unmanly. This unmanliness, it argued, demonstrates unfaithfulness to an asexualized God-man, Jesus Christ, begotten, not made. That's the Nicene formulation. He was begotten, not made. Very, very important. Everything womanly, which was associated with the base irrational passion, is evacuated from the spiritual realm. So to be truly spiritual, you aspire to this manliness. Even women aspire to this passionless manliness. Men who act unmanly as sexually active or passive receivers of sexual passion were thus considered as debasing themselves to womanly forms of unmanliness. There is one more footnote before we can continue to examples of the material consequences of these developments. The footnote concerns the role of Philo of Alexandria in shaping the myth of the Sodomite. Philo is an important Jewish teacher in Alexandria, roughly overlapping the time of Jesus. He was born just before Jesus is placed in history and lived during that period of time. His agenda in this earlier period is very similar to the later Christian agenda. He wanted to make Judaism acceptable in the Roman Empire. So he's making his arguments with that in mind. So Philo adopts Roman Stoic and Platonic ideas about sex and develops a vehement and violent opposition against unmanliness in the shape of male same-sex relationships. He rails against parades popular in Alexandria of his day, which featured men dressed as women. He draws on the Holiness Code in the Hebrew tradition to argue that male same-sex sexual activity and, quote, effeminate behavior should be punished by death. Whereas for most Roman men, the parades that they saw were spectacles of, at the most, some kind of comedic indulgence, something to chuckle at. For Philo, it becomes a matter of life and death. He argues that the law of Moses is coterminous with the Stoic Roman conception of the law of nature, which says, can't have sex between people of the same sex. Philo is also originator of the idea that sin of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible is the practice of same-sex sexual intercourse. Up to this time, this was not a theme that was really picked up anywhere. It's certainly not in the Christian Bible or the Hebrew Bible. It would be his text that would inspire Clement later on, and Ambrose and Chrysostom and Augustine to develop the idea of the sin of the sodomite. So this idea of sodomy, sodomite, etc., it all originates with Philo's framing of that story from the Bible about Sodom and Gomorrah as the problem of men having sex with men. So the next little section I want to look at is the church makes sodomy. Out of this cauldron of the declining Roman Empire and the rising Christian world of the medieval church, the church creates the sin of Sodom, which by the 11th century becomes the abstract concept named as, quote, sodomy. The most impressive study of the theological trajectory of the creation of sodomy is still the work of Mark Jordan in his book, The Invention of Sodomy in Christian Theology. There is no better way to capture the process of the social construction of sodomy than in the words of Jordan himself as he describes the logic of an 11th century cleric called Peter Damian. And this is what Jordan writes. Peter's coining of the term is the result of long processes of thinning and condensing. These processes made it almost inevitable that there would be an abstract term for this specific kind of sin, so specifically stigmatized. So there's this ascendance of a new sin, which becomes named sodomy by the 11th century. There was a slow but inexorable process which increasingly supported vehement disgust and violent reprisal against people accused of the sodomitic sin. This process included the distillation of one of Pope Gregory the Great's 7 deadly sins, which he called luxuria, to a particular focus on homoerotic practice. Mark Jordan shows how the development of confessional manuals and the rediscovery of Roman law, which merged with canon law, contributed to an emerging conviction that the sin of Sodom is the most heinous sin possible. Ever since the Christian Emperor Constantius banned marriage between men in the Roman Empire, which happened in 342, and then penalties that went to the death sentence by 390, severe consequences could be meted out to those accused of the sodomitic sin. But it is by the 15th century that the vehement persecution with brutal punishment became the norm in different jurisdictions. Although much more can be said and is written about the theological process that led to such a brutal behavior on behalf of the Christian Church, the focus here is to confront ourselves with the stark, concrete, material reality of the suffering and pain inflicted in the name of God. So here we get to church meet sodomite. Let's meet some sodomites. What are the consequences of the slow process of thinning and condensing conceptions of manliness that judges male same-sex attraction, love, and erotic encounters as the most offensive sin possible? In this section, I will curate 3 stories from different periods in history to make the consequences apparent. So, I've just chosen them. There's nothing else about it. And the history is well known. There's a lot of history documented, but in theological circles, people don't like to talk much about these stories. We turn first of all to one of the most economically prosperous city-states in the medieval world, the city of Venice. By 1458, the powerful Council of Ten in Venice issued a statement which claimed, and I quote, God, detesting the sin of sodomy, brought down his wrath upon the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and soon thereafter flooded and destroyed the whole world for such horrible sins. Hence our most wise ancestors sought with all their laws and experts to liberate our city from such a dangerous divine judgment. So now, sodomy will bring divine judgment upon the city. While the city actively supported a network of heterosexual brothels to meet the sexual needs of visitors and citizens, at the same time, the night police were given the task of violently stamping out any sodomitic practice. For this, the theological and economic rationales met agreeably. So it was both theological and very political and economical, all together in one piece. The city fathers could not have their prosperity threatened by God's judgment that may come down on the city should they slack in their prosecution of Sodomites. An early example of this kind of prosecution can be found in the records of the city of 1357. It tells the story of a 4-year love affair between Nicoletto Marmagma, a gondola operator, and Giovanni Braganza, his employee. When apprehended and charged, Nicoletto, in his love and desperation to protect Giovanni, tried to argue that he forced Giovanni into the relationship. But rather than go free without Nicoletto, Giovanni confessed that he was a willing partner, and both were summarily burned alive. The city of Venice was relentless and brutal in its pursuit of the extermination of all accused of being sodomites, with the executions occurring in front of Doge Palace. I don't know if any of you have been to Venice, Doge Palace. And Louis Crompton, in his book on the history of homosexuality, writes this, and I quote, "This little square," and this is about Venice, "this little square is the open space before the Doge Palace that connects St. Mark's Square with the Grand Canal and the civic and ceremonial heart of Venice in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, today the focus of casual tourism. The medieval column of justice, dramatically visible from the lagoon stand where they stood 600 years ago, one surmounted by the winged lion of St. Mark, the other by St. Theodore and his crocodile. In all likelihood, more homosexuals died on this spot than anywhere else in Europe before Hitler." So next time you're in Venice. There is much historical research on the actions of the Spanish Inquisition, which was particularly brutal in their great public executions in the auto da fe, and there were also notable exceptions of mercy and grace during these dark days. So, for example, it appears that despite the insistence of the Spanish rulers, the Sicilians, including clergy, often defended the practice of sodomy. In this, both Sicilian church and civil authorities sometimes colluded against the Spanish Inquisition, although many punishments were still meted out. The Spanish Inquisition is an easy target, so I'm not going to focus on that. And its actions are well researched. However, lesser known is how the 16th century Protestant movement picked up medieval and Renaissance prejudices with violent results. And our next example comes from Protestant Geneva. So this is my tradition, Reformed Presbyterian Geneva as the heartland where this all started, the great John Calvin. One of the most important historians that look at this history is William Monte. And William Monte notes that even though executions for sodomy in Calvinist Geneva did not rank as high in number as murder and witchcraft, it was enforced with a high degree of strictness. Some of their victims involved 3 Turkish slaves captured in a battle with the Duke of Savoy in 1590. These slaves were burned alive. A spate of executions occurred in 1610. In this case, a Genevan official named Pierre Canal was arrested for treason and sodomy. Now, Protestants in Geneva used the torture and execution instrument of the wheel. Victims were tied to a large wagon wheel and systematically beaten with a club or iron cudgel until their limbs would break and give way through the spokes of the wheel. Eventually, slowly and very painfully, they would die. Canal was first broken on the wheel, and then his body was burned for sodomy. He had named accomplices, and several trials and more executions followed. Surprisingly, one of the most sobering examples of violent church prosecution of people accused of sodomy occurred in 18th century Protestant Dutch Republic. Even though the Republic was by all accounts one of the most tolerant communities in Europe of that time, this tolerance did not extend to Sodomites. For instance, they had the only Islamic mosque in Europe at that time. But Sodomites, no. The most disturbing event in the history of Protestant theological homophobia is the event that took place in the small Dutch village of Vaan in the province of Groningen. In this case, we can associate this form of theological homophobia with child abuse. A Reformed Protestant minister in that area, Henricus Carl van Beuler, published a book against sodomy in 1731. Even though Vaan was really a small agricultural village and not connected in any way with the spate of prosecutions going on elsewhere in the Republic at the time, the ordeal started with a blind boy of 13 making an accusation against another boy who was also 13. Stern interrogations rendered accusations against 17 other youths aged 17 to 20. The local magistrate and friend of Beuler, Rudolf de Mepsch, was the chief instigator in prosecutions and torture. The accusations took on a life of their own and started to involve political differences in the community. Those arrested, both men and boys, were subjected to brutal torture, leading to some confessions. Eventually, 21 men and boys were convicted, of whom 19 were sentenced to death. The records show that of the executed, 9 boys were in their teens, with one as young as 14 and another 15. Several more men were still in jail awaiting trial, but one died as a result of torture, and provincial authorities intervened, and Mepsch was eventually discredited for his behavior. So, contemporary theologians who insist on the condemnation of homosexual relationships, or same-sex relationships of any kind, often appeal to a kind of idealized concept of a long-term Christian doctrinal consensus. In actual fact, the history of the development of Christian disgust, persecution, and condemnation of same-sex relationships is rooted in a complex process of construction. It originates in profoundly misogynistic Roman conceptions of manliness. It has a long history of thinning and condensing the idea of sodomy from a series of venal sins into same-sex intercourse and effeminacy as the most offensive sin against nature. Most importantly, this process of social construction of sodomy has led to profoundly immoral material consequences associated with the Christian churches, and they still go on. The 3 stories curated here challenge an idealized and sanitized view of Christian teaching and ethical behavior. These stories are in no way small exceptions to a long history of gracious theological difference, but rather representative of a violently brutal tradition in Christian history that did not shrink from the most painful torture, live burning, and even the mutilation of genitalia. One story from the Inquisition, they would cut off penises and hang it around people's necks and then parade them naked down the street and finally burn them. Violence, torture, and killing continues in places like Russia, African countries, and other colonial spaces colonized by particularly the British Empire, it seems. And this history is not based on love and forgiveness, kindness and gentleness, but rather on the construction of misogynistic conceptions of Roman manliness, a manning that requires an unmanning, to go back, that merged in the 4th century with the immutable transcendent order of post-Nicene Christianity and its asexualized God-man, Jesus Christ, begotten, not made. Thank you.